Hi everyone. Welcome back. We're glad to have you with us today. Let's start. My name is Dr. Adam Carter, an obstetrician who has spent years guiding women through one of the most transformative journeys of their lives, pregnancy. I first met Emily Turner at a corporate health workshop where I was invited to give a speech on women's wellness. Standing at the podium, scanning the audience, my gaze landed on her. She sat near the middle, her warm smile and attentive demeanor pulling me in instantly. Emily had this effortless grace, a blend of elegance and relatability that was magnetic. After my talk, she approached me, her energy as vibrant up close as it was from afar. She introduced herself as a dance instructor, her enthusiasm for movement and expression evident in every word. What started as a polite exchange quickly turned into something more profound. She spoke about how dance gave her life meaning, while I shared my passion for helping women embrace their health. By the end of that evening, I was captivated, not just by her beauty, but by her unshakable spirit and zest for life. Over the weeks that followed, our connection deepened. Each date was a revelation, peeling back layers of who we were. Emily spoke lovingly of her parents. Her father, Jack, a retired mechanic with a knack for fixing anything, and her mother, Linda, a former history professor who fueled Emily's love for learning. When it was my turn to share, I opened up about losing my own parents in a tragic car accident years earlier. It was still a tender wound, but Emily's empathy felt like a balm. She listened, not with pity, but with understanding. It was one of her many gifts. After a year of dating, I knew Emily was the one. We married in an intimate ceremony, surrounded by family and close friends. I'll never forget how radiant she looked that day, like the embodiment of joy itself. In that moment, I silently vowed to do everything in my power to make her dreams come true. Emily's biggest dream was to open her own dance studio. She had spent years teaching in other spaces, but yearned for a sanctuary she could call her own, a place where people could not only learn to dance but feel a sense of belonging. Determined to support her, I took out a loan and helped her secure a charming space downtown. It had large, sunlit windows and polished wooden floors, perfect for the vision she had so carefully nurtured. Watching her light up as the studio came to life made every financial strain worth it. For a while, life was bliss. The first 2 years of our marriage felt like a dream, but things took a sharp turn in the third year. Emily grew distant, her vibrant energy replaced by an unshakable fatigue. Intimacy faded, replaced by a quiet tension I couldn't explain. I tried to dismiss it as stress from the studio, but the emotional distance between us kept growing. Then came the shock, a positive pregnancy test. Emily surprised me with the news over dinner, her eyes searching mine for a reaction. At first, I was stunned, but then a tentative hope took root. Maybe this was the fresh start we needed. I brought her to my clinic for tests, and everything appeared to be on track. For the first time in months, I felt genuinely happy. But as the days passed, doubts crept in. Something wasn't adding up. At dinner one evening, I casually asked Emily when she'd first suspected she was pregnant. She told me it had been about a month. My heart sank. The timeline didn't fit. We hadn't been intimate in that time. Trying to suppress my unease, I chalked it up to overthinking. Still, the doubt lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. One evening, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to visit her studio after hours. Emily had told me she was at her parents' house, but as I stepped inside, an eerie chill hung in the air. The lights were off, but something felt off. Walking in her office, I spotted faint drops of liquid on the floor near the desk. My stomach twisted. Someone had been here. Someone who shouldn't have been. I didn't stay long. I locked the door behind me and stepped outside, pulling out my phone. I called my friend Mark, a security expert who handled surveillance for high-level clients. If anyone could help me uncover the truth, it was him. Adam, Mark said, answering on the second ring. What's going on? I need your help, I replied, keeping my voice steady. Something's not right at Emily's studio. I think someone's been there when they shouldn't be. Mark paused, then sighed. You're not about to drag me into some wild conspiracy, are you? I wouldn't call if I wasn't serious, I said firmly. All right, he relented. I'll bring a setup, small camera, mic, live feed. Be there in 30. True to his word, Mark arrived with his gear. He worked swiftly, placing a discreet camera behind a bookshelf and a microphone near the light fixture in Emily's office. As he finished, he studied me closely. "You okay?" he asked. I wasn't sure how to answer. "Yeah," I said, avoiding Mark's gaze. His sharp eyes lingered on me for a moment before he asked, almost casually, "Everything okay with your marriage?" "Yes, so far," I replied, but even as the words left my mouth, they felt hollow. He didn't push further, though I could sense he wasn't convinced. Instead, his attention shifted to the liquid on the floor near the desk. Without a word, Mark crouched, dipped 2 fingers into the small puddle, and brought them to his nose. He sniffed, his brow furrowing slightly. "Huh," he muttered under his breath. Then, standing up, he brushed his hands on his jeans. "Somebody's been getting busy in here." The knot in my stomach tightened, but I kept my face neutral, saying nothing. Mark glanced at me, as if waiting for a reaction. When none came, he cleared his throat and motioned toward the thermostat on the wall. "You said the room was cold, but the AC wasn't on, right?" I nodded. "Yeah." Mark exhaled sharply and shook his head. "All right," he said, his voice edged with something close to pity. "Let's just wait and see if the culprits come back." Before I could respond, he placed a hand on my shoulder. "Adam," he began, his voice quieter now, "what if it's Emily?" The question landed like a gut punch. I clenched my jaw and held his gaze for a moment before answering evenly. "Then she's in for a world of hell. I can promise you that." Mark studied me for a moment before giving a small nod. "Fair enough." To take my mind off things, we decided to head to a nearby bar. A couple of drinks in, Mark was cracking jokes about some of the bizarre surveillance jobs he'd worked over the years. For a little while, his stories helped lighten the mood. But no matter how much I tried to focus on the humor, the weight of what might be happening at the studio sat heavy on my shoulders, a shadow I couldn't shake. A few days later, a phone call threw me completely off balance. "Adam," my father-in-law Jack said as soon as I answered. "Can we meet? There's something I need to talk to you about." Jack wasn't the type to call out of the blue, much less ask to meet. His tone was calm, but there was a tension beneath it that set me on edge. "Sure," I said cautiously. "When and where?" "There's a cafe near my house. Can you meet me there in an hour?" I agreed, though unease bubbled in my chest as I made my way to the cafe. What could he possibly want to talk about? Did he know something about Emily? About us? When I arrived, Jack was already seated at a small table in the corner, a steaming cup of coffee in front of him. He waved me over, and as I approached, I noticed an old, worn wallet sitting next to his cup. "Hey, Jack." I greeted him, taking the seat across from him. "Adam," he said, nodding in return. His usual jovial demeanor was nowhere to be seen, replaced by something far more serious. Without a word, he reached into his wallet, pulled out a small card, and slid it across the table toward me. I frowned as I picked it up. "What's this?" "It's my savings card," he said simply. "Everything I've got is on there." I blinked, confused. "Why are you giving this to me?" Jack leaned forward, clasping his hands tightly together on the table. "I wanted to keep it safe for me," he said quietly. "I might need it soon." His eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw something I'd never expected to see in Jack Turner: fear. He leaned back in his chair, exhaled slowly, and dropped the bombshell. "I have cancer, Adam." The words hit like a thunderclap. I blinked, trying to process what he'd just said. "Cancer?" I echoed, my voice softer than I'd intended. "What kind? How bad is it?" "Lung," he said, his tone steady but grim. "The doctors say I'll need chemotherapy. A lot of it." "Jack, I'm so sorry." I began, but the words caught in my throat. Then another question bubbled up. "Why are you giving me your savings card? Why not give it to Linda?" At the mention of his wife, Jack's face darkened. "I can't trust her," he said flatly. I frowned. "What do you mean?" Jack leaned in closer, lowering his voice even more. "If Linda finds out I've saved this money, she'll burn through it. She can't help herself, Adam. Shopping is her addiction, clothes, jewelry, you name it. Things we don't need. If she gets her hands on this, there'll be nothing left when I need it for my treatment." I stared at him, piecing together the weight of his confession. "So, you've been saving this money secretly?" "Yes," he admitted, his voice heavy. "I've been putting aside what I can, little by little. Stealing from myself, you could say. Linda has no idea it even exists. Between her habits, and what insurance won't cover. This is the only way I can get through this. The gravity of his words settled over me like a heavy fog. This wasn't just about money. It was about survival. Jack, you don't have to explain, I said finally, my voice steady. I'll hold on to it for you. You can count on me. His expression softened, and for a moment, I thought he might cry. You're more than a son to me, Adam, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I swallowed hard, fighting the lump rising in my throat. Your family, Jack. Always. We sat there in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation hanging between us. Finally, Jack stood, extending a hand toward me. I shook it firmly, and we exchanged a somber smile. Thank you, he said. Anytime, I replied. We exchanged a final handshake before leaving the cafe, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The following weeks passed in a blur of routine. Life felt quieter, almost subdued, until one Saturday evening when my phone rang. Carol was at her parents' house again, or so she'd said. The call was from a nearby hospital, requesting my assistance for an emergency operation. Calls like these weren't unusual, and I didn't hesitate. Grabbing my bag, I headed out, mentally preparing for what awaited me. The ER was alive with commotion when I arrived. Nurses and doctors moved quickly, their faces set with focus. A young nurse approached me almost immediately. Dr. Carter, she said, her tone professional but urgent. We have a case of partial placenta previa. The words shifted my mind into overdrive. Placenta previa, especially the partial type, wasn't something to take lightly. It meant the placenta was partially covering the cervix, which could lead to severe bleeding and complications, risking both the mother's and baby's lives. Status? I asked, keeping my tone calm and measured. The patient is stable for now, the nurse replied, motioning toward a nearby room. But she's had some bleeding, and her vitals are inconsistent. Is her family here? I asked, stepping closer to the room. The nurse hesitated, her voice dropping slightly. She's accompanied by a man who says he's her husband. I stopped mid-step and turned to her. But what? Her eyes darted around, ensuring no one else could hear. I don't think he's her husband, she said quietly. I frowned. What makes you say that? It's not about how he looks, she said, crossing her arms. It's how he acts. He's here, but he doesn't seem invested. No worry, no connection. Just distant. Her words gnawed at me. Over the years, I'd seen families in every imaginable state of hope, desperation, and fear. This didn't match any of those patterns. Interesting, I muttered, glancing toward the room. Let's see what we're dealing with. I donned my surgical scrubs and stepped into the operating room. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the air, a familiar anchor in moments of chaos. As I entered, I saw her, Carol, lying on the table, her face pale and streaked with tears. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, her pain palpable. Standing beside her was a man, his hand loosely holding hers. His expression was flat, unreadable. For a brief moment, I froze. A dark thought whispered in the back of my mind. What if I just walked away? Let her suffer? Let her deal with the consequences of whatever she's hiding. But the thought passed as quickly as it came. No matter the circumstances, I had a duty to her and, more importantly, to the life growing inside her. This wasn't about my suspicions or my emotions. It was about doing the job I'd sworn to do. I pushed the thought aside, focusing on the task at hand. Get me an amniocentesis needle. I instructed the nurse, my voice steady. The nurse nodded and began preparing the tools. The needle would allow me to collect a sample of the amniotic fluid, critical for checking the baby's health. But I had another reason, one I hadn't voiced, a DNA test. Something about this situation didn't sit right, and I needed clarity. I moved to the foot of the table, positioning myself for the procedure. Carol whimpered softly, tears slipping from the corners of her eyes. The man beside her hadn't moved, his detachment unsettling. I motioned for him to step closer. He hesitated, but eventually obeyed, his hand still loosely clutching hers. I met his gaze, my tone professional but firm. How did this happen? His eyes flickered to Carol, then back to me. How did what happen? He asked, his voice guarded. I pressed further. How did she end up here? Why is she in this condition? He blinked, And for a moment, something shifted in his expression. Then he chuckled, a low, casual laugh that made my stomach turn. She's hot, and things got rough. She started screaming, so I backed off. Guess that didn't help much, huh? His words were flippant, laced with a sick amusement that made my blood run cold. Before I could respond, the nurse returned with the needle. She handed over a consent form to the man, asking, "Are you her husband?" "Yes," he replied without hesitation, his voice steady. "I'm her husband, and that baby is mine. Save them both, quick. We need to get home." His words struck a nerve. There was an urgency in his tone, but not the kind born of concern. It was more like impatience, as if this was an inconvenience he wanted to be over with. Something about the way he spoke, the way he carried himself, set my teeth on edge. I glanced at Carol, whose eyes flickered open for a moment, locking onto mine. There was fear in her gaze, not just from the pain, but from something deeper. Her lips parted as if she wanted to say something, but no words came. As I prepared to begin the procedure, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing a crucial piece of this puzzle. And whatever it was, I was determined to find it. We exchanged goodbyes at the hospital, the tension between us unspoken but heavy. Carol remained with the man in the room, her face pale and drawn. As I stepped into the hallway, the nurse followed, her expression a mix of concern and curiosity. "Dr. Carter," she called softly. I stopped and turned to her. She hesitated before speaking, her voice low. "Why did you take the amniotic fluid sample?" There didn't seem to be a pressing need. I met her gaze, trying to mask the storm brewing inside me. Finally, I answered in a voice just above a whisper. "That woman is my wife," I said, the words cutting even as I spoke them. "And I need to know if that child is mine. Based on what I've seen, it's doubtful." The nurse's eyes widened briefly before she composed herself. "I understand," she said after a pause, her voice steady. "I'll make sure this stays between us." I gave her a curt nod, grateful for her discretion. With the sample in hand, I headed to the lab. Dividing it into 2 portions, I handed one to Linda, the nurse assisting me. "Take this to the usual lab," I instructed, keeping my tone neutral. "And I'm sending the other to an independent lab for a more detailed test. Make sure the blood sample is included for comparison." Linda's face reflected her understanding of the gravity of the situation. "Got it, Dr. Carter. I'll take care of it." As I watched her leave, the weight of the decision settled over me. The 2-week wait for the results would be excruciating, but the uncertainty and betrayal had already gnawed at me for weeks. I walked out of the lab, exhaustion washing over me. Later that evening, as I tried to find some semblance of peace at home, my phone buzzed. It was my father-in-law, Jack. "Adam," he said, his voice warm but tinged with a rasp. "Tomorrow's my 60th birthday, and I want you to come. It's important." I hesitated, the weight of everything I discovered about Carol pressing down on me. Still, Jack had always been good to me. "Of course," I said, forcing sincerity into my tone. "I'll be there." "Good," Jack replied. "It means a lot." After hanging up, unease crept in again. Carol hadn't come home, which wasn't surprising. She'd messaged earlier, claiming she was at her parents' house, but I knew better. My anger simmered as I imagined where she really was and who she was with. Needing answers, I went to my office and opened the surveillance footage from her studio. My chest tightened as I pressed play. There they were, Carol and the man, her boy toy, as I come to think of him. They were locked in an embrace that quickly turned into something far more intimate. The sight was both confirming and devastating. The next day, the drive to Jack's house felt interminable. My phone buzzed repeatedly with calls and texts from Carol. I didn't answer. One text stood out. "Pick me up from my studio." I ignored it, gripping the steering wheel tightly as anger pulsed through me. When I arrived at Jack's, Brenda greeted me at the door with her usual cheerful smile. But beneath her warm exterior, there was a tension I couldn't ignore. I walked in and sat next to Jack, who was nursing a drink and wearing his usual kind smile. I tried to focus on our conversation, but my mind kept drifting to Carol's betrayal. And then she walked in. Carol stepped into the room, and with her, of course, was Brian, the man from the footage. Her expression faltered for a split second when she saw me, but she quickly composed herself. I was waiting for you to pick me up from the studio, she said, her voice sharp with annoyance. Why didn't you answer my calls? I didn't respond. I turned to Jack, ignoring her entirely, and resumed talking as though she hadn't spoken. Carol's frustration grew. Adam, she snapped. I'm talking to you. I glanced at her briefly, then turned to Brenda, who was blissfully unaware of the tension simmering in the room. Dear mother-in-law, I said, my tone deliberately cool. Why did you let her go to the studio last night? Didn't you see how hard it was for her to wait for me? Brenda blinked, confusion clouding her features. What do you mean? She asked, her voice tentative. I stood, pulling out my phone with a steady hand. Here, I said, holding up the screen for Brenda to see. It was Carol's message from the night before. I'll be at my parents' house tonight. Don't wait up. Brenda's eyes widened as she read the text. She looked from me to Carol, then to Brian, her face a mixture of confusion and dawning realization. Carol's expression tightened, her earlier frustration now replaced by nervousness. Adam, what are you doing? Carol asked, her voice lower, a warning tone creeping in. I didn't respond, letting the silence speak louder than words. Brenda, now visibly rattled, looked at Carol with questions she couldn't seem to voice. And Jack, watching it all unfold, sat back in his chair, his drink forgotten in his hand. The room was thick with tension, the unspoken truths hanging in the air like a storm about to break. I stared at Brenda, her confusion etched deep on her face. She seemed genuinely lost, unable to comprehend the reality unraveling before her. I decided to press further. Oh, so Carol was here last night, wasn't she? I asked, my voice slicing through the tension like a knife. Carol smiled, a smile she thought would charm the room, but one I knew all too well. It was her mask, the same one she wore whenever she was cornered. Of course I was here. Right, Mom? She said, her tone laced with false sweetness. Brenda, oblivious to the mounting evidence, nodded quickly. Yes, she was here, she said defensively. I turned to Jack, keeping my voice sharp. You must have missed her then, Jack. She was clearly right here, wasn't she? The sarcasm in my tone wasn't lost on him. Jack's eyes flickered with understanding, but he stayed silent, his face tightening. Brian stood awkwardly to the side, trying to blend into the background. I wasn't going to let him. I stepped closer, my gaze drilling into him. Who's this guy? And why do I get the feeling he won't be walking out of here with both legs intact? Before I could take another step, Carol quickly positioned herself between us, her voice trembling. Don't you dare, she hissed. He's just a friend. I looked Brian up and down, my disgust evident. A friend? Isn't he a little young for you? My words were deliberately cutting, and they hit their mark. Carol's face reddened, and her voice rose. Shut up, Adam. You don't know what you're talking about. The room grew quieter as the tension peaked. Brenda, her face flushed with anger, suddenly erupted. Adam, that's enough. Are you accusing my daughter of cheating on you? Her voice was shrill, filled with indignation. I turned to her, my voice calm but icy. No, Brenda. I'm not accusing her. I'm proving it. The words hung heavy in the room, their weight undeniable. I locked eyes with Carol, my tone firm. Where were you last night? I demanded. Carol's expression faltered. She looked at Brenda, seeking support. I was here, she said, her voice shaking but defiant. Brenda quickly backed her up. Yes, she was here, she confirmed, sounding defensive and almost panicked. I sighed, the frustration boiling over. Brenda, I said, my voice deliberately measured. I used to love you like my own mother. But now, that love has turned into something else entirely. The room grew still. Carol was visibly panicked, her body shifting uncomfortably as the lies began to unravel. I'm going to ask you one more time, Carol, I said, each word deliberate and heavy. Where were you? My tone was a warning, a promise of consequences. Because if you don't tell me now, don't blame me for what's about to happen. A few relatives had filtered into the room, sensing the tension. Their curious eyes were locked on the unfolding drama. I turned to them briefly, my voice cold. Oh, good. You're just in time. The show is about to start. Without waiting for an answer, I pulled out my phone and connected it to the TV. The screen flickered to life, and what appeared on it made the room go silent. The footage showed Carol on a stretcher, being wheeled into the hospital. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with pain. I turned to Brenda, letting my voice rise. "Well, Brenda, you never told me you had two identical daughters." Carol's face turned ashen as she stammered. What are you doing?" "I fell. I hurt myself." "You still here? Unim peso. And you didn't think to call me? Your husband? Why did you hide it?" My voice carried an edge that silenced the room further. Carol fumbled for an answer, her lips trembling. "I didn't want you to worry," she mumbled weakly. I smirked, my voice cutting. "Or maybe you were too busy with him to think about me." I jabbed a finger toward Brian. Without waiting for a response, I queued up the next video, footage from the studio. The screen filled with an image that made the room collectively gasp. There was Carol and Brian, locked in an embrace that quickly escalated. As the scene played out, ending with her screaming in pain and them rushing to the hospital, the murmurs of shock grew louder. Carol's face drained of all color. The betrayal was now undeniable, laid bare for everyone to see. I turned to her, my voice cold and unyielding. "Carol, I'm leaving. Don't bother coming home. I'll be filing for divorce." Her mouth opened to protest, but I cut her off. "And it'll be under adultery," I added, my eyes locked on hers. Her tears were already welling, but I didn't care. Turning to Brenda, I let my gaze harden. "And you, Brenda? If you think you can defend her, think again. She'll leave this marriage the same way. She came in empty-handed." Brenda's mouth fell open, her voice rising in panic. "Adam, you can't do this. She's your wife. She's carrying your child." I took a deep breath, my resolve unwavering. "She needs to prove it's my child. If it is, I'll take care of it. If not, not my child, not my problem." With that, I walked out, leaving the stunned silence of the room behind me. The next morning, the weight of everything still pressed on me. I tried to focus on the day ahead, but a call from Brenda shattered the fragile calm. "Adam," she said, her voice strained, "we're coming over to pick up Carol's things." I paused, the anger bubbling up again. "Fine y mater." This wasn't over, not by a long shot. A few minutes after Brenda's call, they showed up. Carol walked in with that air of defiance she perfected, heading straight upstairs with Brenda. I stayed downstairs, trying to breathe through the frustration that seemed to consume me. For a moment, I thought I could let this pass without confrontation, but then I heard the noise. Rustling fabric, drawers being opened, things being shuffled around. My ears perked up, and my gut told me something wasn't right. When Carol came back downstairs, there was a faint, smug smile on her face. It wasn't hard to see she was up to something, though I couldn't put my finger on it just yet. She didn't say a word as she left with Brenda. A few minutes later, I went upstairs and stepped into the bedroom. That's when I saw it. My wallet lying on the floor, discarded like trash. My heart sank. I picked it up and immediately noticed the missing cards. She'd taken all of them. My stomach twisted as I pieced it together. I grabbed my phone and quickly called the bank, canceling every single card before she could do any more damage. The weight of her betrayal was crushing, but I couldn't afford to dwell on it. I had to act fast. Without hesitation, I dialed Jack. "Jack," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Carol took my wallet. You need to cancel your card immediately." There was silence on the other end before he finally responded, his voice shaky. "What? Are you serious?" "Yeah," I replied, swallowing the lump in my throat. "She took it. You need to cancel it now." He agreed, though the shock in his voice was palpable. At the time, I thought that would be the end of it. I assumed we'd managed to stop the damage before it spiraled further. But just hours later, I received a call that shook everything. It was Brenda, her voice frantic. "David, you need to come to the hospital. Jack's had a stroke." The words hit me like a freight train. "A stroke?" I managed to choke out. "How? What happened?" "He's not doing well," she said, her voice trembling. "His heart, his lungs, the cancer, it's all flaring up." And David, her tone grew heavier. "Carol's stolen over $200,000. We can't afford his treatment now." The floor felt like it had fallen out from under me. $200,000? I asked, barely able to process the number. Brenda nodded, tears streaming down her face. She drained his account, David. He told me about the card. She took everything. My chest tightened as a storm of emotions roared inside me. Anger, disbelief, guilt. Have you talked to her? I asked, forcing my voice to stay level. I tried, Brenda said, her voice cracking. She won't answer. I clenched my jaw, my frustration rising. The betrayal, the money, the strain on Jack's health, it was all too much. And then, as if the universe was determined to twist the knife, I learned the truth the next day. Carol was living with Brian. That was the breaking point. I called her, my voice cold and controlled. Carol, I began, you need to return the money you stole. There was silence on the other end, followed by a sharp, mocking laugh. I deserve that money, she said, her tone dripping with arrogance. I'm not giving it back. It was your father's money, I reminded her, my voice firm and unrelenting. You can't just take what doesn't belong to you. You're lying, she spat. You just want to make me look bad. I felt my blood boil, but before I could respond, Brenda took the phone from me. Carol, she said, her voice trembling with desperation. Your father is in critical condition. Please come to the hospital. He needs you. Carol's voice hardened. I'm not coming. Stop trying to guilt-trip me. This isn't my problem. The line went dead. Hours later, Brenda came to me, her eyes wide with disbelief. She's here, she whispered. Carol finally showed up. When Carol walked into the hospital room, her face was pale. Her eyes widened at the sight of Jack's condition, the tubes, the machines, the fragile man lying in the bed. For a moment, she looked shaken, but the guilt didn't last. Just as quickly as she'd arrived, she turned and walked out, leaving us behind without a word. It didn't take long to find out where she'd gone. She'd gone straight to Brian. When I learned the truth, I wasn't surprised, though it still felt like another knife in the chest. Carol hadn't spent the money after all. She'd withdrawn it and handed it to Brian. She thought she could trust him, but when she confronted him, the situation escalated exactly as I expected. I never got any money from you, Brian told her, his tone cold and dismissive. Carol's desperation grew. You're lying, she shouted. Give it back. Brian stood his ground, unmoved by her pleas or anger. Their argument dragged on until finally she stormed out defeated. She returned to the hospital hours later, her face haggard, her posture broken. She looked at me, her voice flat, almost lifeless. David, she began, I took the money and gave it to Brian, but now he won't give it back. Brenda, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, gasped. Her shock and disappointment were written all over her face. The weight of Carol's betrayal, the money, and Jack's declining health pressed down on all of us, leaving the room steeped in silence. Brenda's disbelief was evident. Her shoulders slumped as though the weight of everything had finally crushed her. She turned to me, her voice barely above a whisper. Adam, is there anything you can do? I took a deep breath, steadying myself as my thoughts raced. I'll try my best, I said, the words more hopeful than I felt. With that, I turned and walked out of the room, heading toward hospital management. I needed to figure out if there was any way to salvage the situation. But just as I reached the hallway, my phone rang. It was Brenda. Her voice, when she spoke, was flat, void of any emotion. Adam, she said, the words hitting me like a blow to the chest. Leave it. Jeff is gone. He left us. The world seemed to stop. My heart felt like it had been ripped from my chest as her words sank in. I didn't respond. Instead, I ran. I bolted back to the room, my footsteps pounding against the sterile hospital floor. When I burst through the door, the sight that greeted me was one I would never forget. Brenda stood by the window, her back to the room, her shoulders shaking as though she was barely holding herself together. Carol sat beside Jeff, her face buried in her hands, crying softly. And there he was, Jeff, lifeless in the bed. In that moment, I realized I had lost a second father figure. Jeff, who had always supported me, who had trusted me, was gone. And the bitter truth was that he'd been stolen from us. Not by his illness, but by his daughter's greed and selfishness. The weight of that realization hit harder than I cared to admit. The days following his death were heavy with grief and anger. After the funeral, Brenda called me. Her voice was thick with regret. Adam, she began, I'm sorry. I should have listened to you sooner. I stood by Carol when I shouldn't have, and now I've disowned her. I can't forgive her for what she's done. Her words caught me off guard, but what she said next left me speechless. I've made a will, she said quietly. I've named you as the beneficiary of my assets. I swallowed hard, emotions swirling in my chest. Thank you, Brenda, I replied, my voice steady despite the lump in my throat. I forgive you, but I'll never forgive Carol. Not for this. Not for Jeff. Neither will I, Brenda said softly. Those were her final words before the call ended. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a weight lift, even if just slightly. 3 days later, I decided it was time to confront Carol once and for all. I went to her studio, where she was working on yet another project. I handed her the legal papers, making my intentions clear. You're to vacate the studio immediately, I said, my voice cold. It's under my name, and I'm the one paying off the loan. At first, she didn't react. Then, the realization hit, and her eyes burned with anger. You can't do this, she hissed, standing abruptly. This is my studio. I didn't flinch. Not anymore, Carol. You're out. The divorce was a nightmare. Carol fought me tooth and nail, dragging out the process, trying every tactic to make it as painful as possible. But the truth was on my side. I knew I wasn't the father of her child, though I had to wait for the court to order a paternity test to prove it. When the day finally came, Carol resisted, throwing tantrums and accusing me of trying to ruin her life. The judge, however, wasn't moved by her theatrics. He ordered the test, and Carol had no choice but to comply. I'll never forget the day she finally caved. She called me, her voice dripping with frustration. Fine, Adam, she spat. I'll take the damn test. But this isn't over. You'll regret this. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. When the test results came back, they confirmed what I already knew. I wasn't the father. Walking into the lawyer's office, I saw the envelope on the table and felt a strange mix of vindication and sorrow. The truth was undeniable now, and Carol could no longer manipulate the situation. I knew you were lying, I said to her when we sat down. My voice was steady cold. I'm not the father, Carol. This is over. Her face turned red, her eyes filling with rage. You think this is it? She hissed. You really think I'm just going to walk away? You'll pay for this, Adam. You'll regret everything. But it didn't matter anymore. The truth was out. The courtroom was tense as the judge prepared to announce his verdict. Carol sat across from me, her expression defiant but cracking under the pressure. Miss Turner, the judge began, his authoritative voice echoing in the room. After reviewing the evidence, this court has determined that Mr. Carter is not the biological father of your child. Therefore, he is not obligated to provide any child support or expenses for the child's upbringing. Carol's face reddened, her composure crumbling. Before she could protest, the judge continued. However, the court has considered your request for alimony. Given the circumstances of your marriage and separation, the court awards you $1,000 per month for the next 3 years to assist with your transition. Her eyes widened at the mention of alimony. It wasn't much, but it was something, a small lifeline she could cling to after everything she had lost. I stood silently, watching her face as she processed the outcome. She had destroyed everything, her family, her reputation, her future. And for what? In the end, the truth had won, but the scars left behind would last a lifetime. The judge wasn't finished. His voice cut through the courtroom with authority. Miss Turner, he said, addressing Carol directly, I encourage you to use this time to focus on stability and responsibility for yourself and your child. The court will not entertain any further claims regarding child support from Mr. Adam Carter. The gavel came down, signaling the end of the case. Carol didn't respond immediately. She stood slowly, her fists clenched at her sides. Her eyes narrowed, and her lips twisted into a sneer. You think this is over? She hissed, her voice trembling with anger. I'll make sure you regret this. You'll all see. As I left the courtroom, I could hear her muttering under her breath behind me. It wasn't hard to imagine her plotting her next move, and sure enough, it didn't take long. Carol filed a new case, this time against Brian, the real father of her child. She demanded child support, forcing him to face the consequences he'd been avoiding. Brian was summoned to court, his carefree demeanor replaced by nervousness. He clearly hadn't expected to be dragged into this mess. The judge addressed him with the same stern tone he'd used with Carol. "Mr. Bryan," the judge began, "you are being asked to take a paternity test. We've already seen the results from the previous case, which confirm that Mr. Adam Carter is not the father. You are the biological father, and as such, you are obligated to provide child support for the child in question." Bryan's face went pale, and I could see the panic creeping into his expression. He stammered, trying to come up with an excuse. I didn't know. I wasn't sure," he said, his voice faltering. The judge raised an unimpressed eyebrow. "I understand this may be difficult, Mr. Bryan, but the law is clear. You will be required to take a paternity test to confirm your responsibility. Failure to comply will result in legal consequences." With no way out, Bryan reluctantly agreed to the test. The courtroom was tense as he gave in, his shoulders slumping in defeat. A few days later, the results were in. Bryan was indeed the father. The truth was now undeniable, and the court wasted no time in holding him accountable. "Mr. Bryan," the judge said, his voice steady, "you are confirmed as the biological father. The court will proceed to determine your child support obligations and other financial responsibilities toward the child." Bryan stood, his head hanging low. "I guess I have no choice," he muttered. "No choice at all," the judge replied firmly. "But let this be a reminder that we all have responsibilities, whether we want them or not." Carol glanced at Bryan with a mixture of contempt and bitterness. She knew he was her last hope for financial support, but the resentment between them was palpable. "Not long after the ruling, I heard about a fire at Bryan's house. At first, the details were vague. Some blamed an electrical issue, while others whispered about foul play. But I knew better. Life had its way of catching up to people like Bryan. A few days after the fire, more news broke. Bryan had been brutally beaten in what police described as a robbery gone wrong. The blurry images on the news showed him sitting on a curb, bloodied and swollen, clutching his chest. His face was barely recognizable. As the report unfolded, the grim details emerged: multiple broken bones, extensive bruises, and even a ruptured testicle. Bryan's reckless life had finally caught up with him, leaving him broken in more ways than one. The hospital reports painted a bleak picture. Insurance would cover his medical bills, but his injuries were severe. He'd never walk the same again. Watching his downfall, I couldn't summon much sympathy. After all, Bryan had played his part in the chaos, and now he was paying the price. Still, a part of me couldn't ignore how the universe seemed to be balancing the scales. Carol, too, was left to reckon with the consequences of her choices. She may have secured alimony from me, but the court had also handed her the responsibility of raising her child with financial support from Bryan. Yet, that victory was hollow. Carol had burned every bridge: her family, her reputation, her dignity, and now she was left to face the harsh reality of her decisions. In the end, she got what she wanted, but at what cost? But that was it for Carol. She had clawed and schemed her way to get what she wanted: money, child support, and a fleeting sense of control. Yet, it was never enough. She had burned every bridge, isolated herself from everyone who had once cared for her. Even her own mother, Brenda, had severed ties. Carol was alone, left to live in the wreckage of her choices. For a while, she managed to maintain the illusion of stability. The money and child support gave her just enough to scrape by, but the cracks in her life grew wider with each passing day. The truth about her character had spread like wildfire. Friends distanced themselves. Parents at her child's school whispered behind her back. Every job application she submitted was met with polite rejections. Carol's reputation preceded her, and it wasn't one she could escape. Her relationship with Bryan didn't survive the strain either. After his brutal beating and the fire that left him with nothing, Bryan wanted nothing to do with her. He blamed her for everything: his ruined finances, his destroyed health, even his shattered future. The resentment between them festered until Bryan finally disappeared, leaving Carol to shoulder the responsibility of raising their child alone. And then, as if fate hadn't punished her enough, her financial support began to crumble. Bryan, unable to hold down steady work due to his injuries, fell behind on child support payments. The court ordered wage garnishments, but the sporadic payments were a drop in the bucket compared to what she needed. Carol's alimony from me had run out by then, and with no real income of her own, she was drowning in debt. As the years passed, her life spiraled further out of control. Bill collectors hounded her. She moved from one cheap apartment to another, each worse than the last. Her child, now old enough to understand, began asking questions. Questions Carol couldn't answer. Questions about why they didn't have a stable home, why no one came to visit, why other kids' moms didn't seem as angry or sad all the time. Eventually, her child grew distant, tired of the constant chaos. The bond between them frayed until it finally snapped. By the time her child was old enough to leave, they did so without looking back, taking the last shred of connection Carol had left. The last I heard of her was years later. Someone mentioned she was living in a dingy studio apartment on the outskirts of town. She had aged beyond her years, the bitterness etched deep into her face. She spent her days alone, clinging to a past that had long abandoned her, the weight of her choices dragging her into obscurity. Carol had finally gotten what she deserved. Not the life she wanted, but the life she had built with her lies, greed, and selfishness. There were no second chances, no redemption arcs. Life had given her plenty of opportunities to change, and she had squandered every one. In the end, she became a prisoner of her own making, a cautionary tale whispered among those who remembered her. Some might call it karma. Others might call it justice. Either way, Carol's life had turned into the nightmare she had spent so long trying to avoid. And as much as I wanted to feel pity for her, I couldn't. She had destroyed so many lives along the way, including her own. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. See you soon.